So good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Teresa Hebron, and I'm the program director for Mountain West Digital Library and the co-chair of the Outreach and Assessment Working Group, along with Challen Wright from University of Nevada, Reno. This is the third and final session in our series, Resourcefully Assessing Critical Approaches to Assessment. In June, we had a session covering quality assessment of open education resources, or OERs. And last month, the Wikimedia Working Group gave us an overview of tools and resources for assessing Wikimedia content use and impact. But if you're joining us here today, this is dCraft Toolkit, Assessing Use and Reuse of Digital Collections, presented by various members of the Digital Content Reuse and Assessment Toolkit, that's dCraft, team. So our presenters today in alphabetical order are Ranti Junus, who's the Systems Librarian for Electronic Resources at Michigan State University. Then there's Ayla Stein Kenfield, who's Associate Professor and Repository Services Librarian at University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. And finally, Santi Thompson, who is currently the Interim Associate Dean for Organizational Development, Learning, and Talent, and a librarian at University of Houston University Libraries. So as I said before, we are recording this session with closed captioning enabled. If you'd like to take a moment to make sure your audio is muted by clicking that microphone icon in the lower left-hand side of your Zoom toolbar, we'd appreciate that. And if you need to drop out early for any reason, thanks in advance for coming. And DPLA will be making this recording available shortly. So feel free to use the chat to post any questions or just join the conversation along the way. And we're also going to have a brief feedback survey if we can trouble you to tell us how we did. And we'll share that link in the chat towards the end of our time together today. So with that, I'll turn things over to the dCraft team.
Thanks, Teresa. Can you all see that I've shared my screen? I don't know if I can get a thumbs up or yeah, okay, great. Well, thank you everyone for attending. We really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all about dCraft. And so you all have an understanding of where we're going today. I am going to start us off with some introductions, although Teresa did a great job of that, and some session norms, which Teresa also did a great job of. Then I'll also be talking about the background of the project. And then I'll hand it over to Ayla, who will talk about our quest to define use and reuse. And then both Ayla and Ranti will be talking about components of the toolkit. And finally, I'll sort of wrap up this session by showing a live demo and also doing sort of an activity with you all to close this out. And then, of course, we'll have time for hopefully questions and answers. So as Teresa said, there are three of us here representing the project. I'm Santi Thompson. I served as the principal investigator for the project. Also joined here with, by Ayla and by Ranti. And we had talked about maybe all of us introducing ourselves, but since Teresa's already done it, I mean, if Ayla and Ranti, you still want to, we can, but otherwise maybe we'll just move forward with that since Teresa did such a good job of the introduction. And just sort of housekeeping things, feel free to chat at any time. We'll be monitoring it as well as folks from DPLA. We'll respond to any questions you might have right before the activity and then after if needed. You know, once we get to the true question and answer session, you can feel free to unmute and sort of verbally ask if you would like. But if you also want to put it in your question in the chat, that's totally fine too. So I'm going to lead us off with some background on the project so you all have an understanding of sort of where we've been and why we've done this work. So dCraft, or the Digital Content Reuse Assessment Framework Toolkit, which is a mouthful, which is why we came up with dCraft. It is an open access and collaboratively developed toolkit that documents available assessment tools, best practices, and ethical guidelines for measuring the reuse of digital objects or digital assets, with the intent to facilitate both standardization and impact measurement in the digital library field. It was generously funded by the Institute of Museum and Library Services as a grant and concluded its work in June of 2023. And so you all know that this project doesn't come out of nowhere. It's been many years in the making through the efforts of one of the working groups in the Digital Library Federation's Assessment Interest Group. And that entity, which anyone can join, is a group that seeks to engage the digital library practitioner field in developing best practices and guidelines for various kinds of digital library assessment. Before we get into the details of what the toolkit is, we want to make sure we recognize all of the labor and the amazing efforts that went into the development and the release of the toolkit. And so there are many groups that have contributed to the project over time. Many of them are listed here on this slide. First are the project team members who collaboratively designed the project and worked really closely with other groups to build, to test, and to ultimately deploy the toolkit. We also benefit from contributions of 5 what we call DCRAFT consultants. And those folks added additional expertise in key themes, including general library assessment, privacy, diversity and equity, instructional design, and accessibility. And we also had an advisory group that was made up of experts representing the breadth of the galleries, libraries, archives, museums, and repositories, or GLAMOR community. And this group provided critical feedback and guidance on all aspects of the project, including our methods and our deliverables. And complete bios for all of these members are available on the DCRAFT project website, which is listed here on the slide. So before we get into the details of the toolkit, you might find yourself wondering why DCRAFT exists and maybe why it's worth your time. And just to give you some additional background, the project team proposed this grant because digital library practitioners, meaning many of you, were interested in assessing reuse of digital objects in your collections, but weren't sure how to do so. We know that from talking to a bunch of different partners and stakeholders over time, that many practitioners wanted to build user-centric collections that were responsive to user needs, as well as they wanted to be able to demonstrate the value of the materials that they were stewarding to various different partners. And of course, last but not least, we also often want to know how to engage communities represented in our collections as partners, and how to do that with the highest regard of ethics and care possible. So you're about to find out a lot of those things as we move forward with today's presentation. So I'm now going to pass it over to Ayla, who will continue with the conversation.
Thank you, Santi. So I'm going to take a little bit of a step back because when we were coming up with this toolkit, we realized that we didn't have good definitions, or we didn't know what the difference was between use and reuse. And that's pretty essential in order to assess reuse. So we, it turns out that this is way more complicated than it may seem initially. So for this webinar, I'm going to just briefly summarize. So for the purposes of this project for DCRAFT, we defined use as passive interaction with a digital object that indicates potential interest and or value to an external user, whereas reuse is defined as active interaction with digital objects that demonstrate an interest or value to an existing or to an external user. So despite these definitions, it's still not really clear. There's not still, let me try the sentence again. Despite these definitions, there isn't always a clear-cut distinction between use and reuse. So we consider use and reuse to be on a spectrum with different levels of engagement, as you can see on this slide. Passive engagement actions are towards the use end of the spectrum, while active engagement actions are towards the reuse side of the spectrum. Unfortunately, we don't have time to go into further detail about the differences between use and reuse of digital objects, but we wrote a paper that won an award where we present a complete model combining the definitions for use and reuse, the levels of engagement, and examples that explore the nuances of use and reuse. So, and I think we'll put the link to that article in the chat. So now we're going to jump into the toolkit, specifically the ethical guidelines. The ethical guidelines for assessing reuse is the first component of the toolkit. And it addresses key principles for responsibly assessing reuse, including incorporating and prioritizing concerns from Indigenous and underrepresented communities, their concerns and ideas, our concerns and ideas, as well as user privacy. So the need for these ethical guidelines on assessing reuse was identified in part, let me try it once again, was identified in our previous grant project, Measuring Reuse, via a series of focus group discussions centered around privacy, cultural sensitivity, and controversial reuse of digital collection materials. So I'm laughing because hindsight is 2020, ironically. So initially, the ethical guidelines being the first component of the toolkit, we had naively planned it to be finished within the first 8 months of the grant period, so March 2020. We all know what happened in March 2020. And so that thoroughly derailed the timeline. And we actually didn't finish the guidelines, the ethical guidelines for assessing reuse until May 2023, near the end of the grant, so over 3 years later, because it turns out ethics is actually really hard. So I'm going to briefly describe the process. We did a literature review identifying existing work regarding ethical consumption and reuse of cultural heritage, artifacts, knowledge, and data. Then we wrote these guidelines collaboratively we had a subgroup in our broader project team that wrote these guidelines collaboratively. There we go. Originally, we called the guidelines a code of ethics, but during the writing process, we felt that code was really too formal. And so we renamed the document to be ethical guidelines. The guidelines went through multiple levels of review and revision. So first, of course, was, as I mentioned, there was a subgroup of us who had written the guidelines. So the full project team did the initial review and review. And then our advisory group. And then we had an open comment period in 2 phases. So first, we solicited input and contributions from diverse and traditionally underrepresented populations, particularly American Indigenous communities, LGBTQIA+, communities of color, disabled communities. So after 2 weeks, we opened commenting up to the entire digital library community, which we mean to include any cultural heritage and repository community that makes digital objects available. So libraries, archives, museums, data repositories, etc. After each review, we revised the guidelines, except for the open comment period. We just treated that as one whole level of review. And then so people could provide comments via 2 options. One was Google Docs. And then we also had a Qualtrics survey if people wanted to submit anonymous feedback, which most people gave feedback via Google Docs. So the sections of the ethical guidelines, right? Each ethical guideline has an let me try and sentence again. The sections of the ethical guidelines document are, of course, the introduction, a scope of the document, a glossary of terms or terminology, core values, and suggested further reading. So the core values that we address, within the core values, we address how the following concepts relate to a reuse assessment. So ideas, because we needed a new acronym for EDI and accessibility, social justice, privacy, traditional knowledge, cultural heritage, and intellectual property, professional development and training, transparency, and awareness. So each core value has a description of the value and practical considerations when assessing reuse. The complete ethical, let me try to sentence one more time. The complete ethical guidelines document is, of course, available on the DCRAF website and has been translated into both Spanish and Mandarin. So jumping back to the open commenting period real quick, it revealed that the open comments revealed that there were several of the core values in the ethical guidelines that needed significant revisions, and that these revisions required additional expertise that the project team or our consultants, none of us had. So we hired experts to address these lingering questions, which you can see on this slide. So Becky used for user privacy, Scott Young for data privacy, and Monique Manach for traditional knowledge, cultural heritage, and intellectual property. And now I'm going to pass it to Ranti.
Thank you, Ayla. So I'm going to speak about some other primary feature of the toolkits, wherein the ethical guideline is like the guideline that we follow in order to develop this tool. So the craft team provides detailed information on its categories of assessment method, including information for beginning practitioners as well as advanced practitioners. We refer to these as recommended practices. So to develop the list of methods and the tools used for those methods for the recommended practices section, the team began with a thorough literature review of cultural heritage assessments, practices, or articles published between 2010 and 2019 to identify possible methods and tools that could help practitioners collect data for a reuse assessment. The team then collected about 135 articles and case studies and used a platform called Deduce. It's a platform for collaboratively analyzing qualitative and mixed method research data. Use the platform to read through the materials, code topical content, and extract and organize and tag expert themes and topic. So after analyzing the deduced data and synthesizing the resulting coded data, the team identified 8 central methods currently in existing for collecting data about reuse of digital content. On the slide, under the data collection methods on the left of this slide, you can see our recommended methods. Alert services, L-metrics, citation analysis, focus groups, and interview, link analysis, point of use, and general survey, reserve image lookup, and web analytics. We also have a whole list of tools that can be used to conduct each of the methods above. Like on the right side of the slides, it's just samples of the tools. So, but this is only some of them. Next, please. So while a few of the better known methods already have extensive online documentation, the toolkits that we created explains the methods in an hopefully in an easy to understand way from the perspective of assessment in the climate institutions, especially. So the screenshot on this slide shows the methods that were identified and gives you a quick definition for each in easy to scan format on the website. And then if you were to click one of the methods on the previous slides on the website, the instance, for example, alert services, you would see a web page with a lot of more information. And we, on this website, documentation on each method includes the following categories of information: the definition, the application for using this method to assess use and reuse, common tools that can be used to do this method, and each tool's linked to additional pages with explanation about the tools, and ethical guidelines for using this method, the strengths and weaknesses, the highlight examples that demonstrates the methods in use at the climate institution, and additional resources, and contribution to content. So additionally, on each method page, there is a functional tutorial available that will be shown by Santi as one of the example. And then if you notice, the tools are linked to additional pages. So we have a lot of cross-linking to each other. And this is what those pages look like. One example. So each tool comes with the web page outlining needed information to use for the tool. The things such as the basic information on the URL, cost and whether it's open source, how to use the tool for use or use assessment, including links out to existing tutorials on the tools. Another ethical guidelines again as well for using the tool. Additional guidelines for responsible practice, strength, particularly in comparison with alternative tools, and also weaknesses, and additional resources. So every tool page includes links to all of the methods that use the tool. And for instance, both alert services and Almetrics use a tool called BuzzSumo, as well as the alternative tools that you can consider in place of the tool. And when developing these recommended practices, the grant team populated of this information from what we had gleaned from our own expertise, the literature review, and other sources as we research. And at this point, we want to include additional expertise to ensure that the information was comprehensive, accurate, and up to date. We were able to hire 6 experts to examine the method and their associated tools in order to verify, supplement, expand, or correct the information. The exception of this was link analysis, for which we were not able to get an expert to review. So another consideration of a feature that Toolkit is the takedown policy sections. While doing the research and talk interview with the practitioners, it is shown that the takedown policy is needed. This is unusual for assessment tutorial, for typical assessment toolkit, but then it was one of the primary needs identified by practitioner and was a key to use case that our grant started that we would address. In these sections, this section walks practitioners through the consideration they will need to think through such as the audience, or who the policy is written for and where is it hosted, the purpose, or what is the takedown policy means for the institution and what goals does it fulfill, and the parameters of the policy, like what types of content that will qualify and under what circumstances, and what kind of concerns the institution will or will not consider, action the institution is willing to take, and what different levels of takedown look like. And the removal, the index, suppression, restriction, content warning, redaction, edits, anonymization, and etc. And it's really up to institution how they want to develop this. And also talk about the process, like these steps that the requester will take, steps that reviewer will take, what communication looks like, and etc. And the revision, review and update cycles, versioning, trigger events. And finally, prevention, looking at internal policies of the procedures, and then that could be changed or enacted to prevent issues in the first place. In addition to this consideration, the toolkit also includes a sample policy that institutions can use to start off with and tweak with their own needs, as well as link to policies that other Glamour institutions are using right now. So after we collect all this data, what do we do with that then? Telling stories of impact requires practitioners to assemble key pieces of information that will build the story's composition, assess with fascinating in the process, and address the story's audience. This page documents facets or categories of information frequently found in impact reporting. It includes a definition of examples for each facet to help guide practitioners through thought process exercise to help them plan and articulate the stories they will tell. And it also includes links to real-world examples of practitioners, storytelling, and truth. And I have to say, from my perspective, when I look into this, I feel like a lot of libraries and digital collection need help in doing the marketing. We're not necessarily good at marketing, so this is a good tool to look at into and learn from. And then finally, we have modules that we have modules that can be used to as a learning project object that introduce the practitioners to each of the methods that we talk about. And they are linked from the method page in the toolkits. So this learning object can be accessed asynchronously. So you don't have to be attend at a certain time event, like our this webinar, and our self-page. So and then you can come back to this anytime, or return to the beginning, or skip to the other end. They contain much of what is found in the documentation on the method page, but hopefully in a more digestible and engaging form to walk you through the concept of this method. Most tutorials include offer few videos and offer quizzes to help practitioners to assess what they have learned. Each recommended practices has a functional module, a tutorial module, as well as the takedown policies and the telling stories impact. And I use this a lot too because my learning mode is much better if I have some view or images, and then I do this to supplement things I read. So I hope you find it useful as well. So I'll then pass to Santi.
All right, thank you, Ranti and Ayla. So we're gonna walk through part of the toolkit now as a guided activity to give you all a sense of what might be possible for your own sort of assessment work moving forward. So what we're going to do, and I'm gonna attempt to do this live, we're going to take an image, the one shown here, entitled 1996 Olympic Games in celebration of the current Olympic Games, which is an image from one of the, and I'm probably going to get all these words wrong, one of the members of DPLA, the New Georgia Encyclopedia. The link to the image is found on the slide, and maybe Ayla or Ranti can put that into the chat. So if folks want to go find it, download it, and then run the same activity locally, you can, right? But what I thought I would do is I'm going to demonstrate it for you all, and then maybe leave some time, depending on how many questions or what people want to talk about, maybe we leave some time as well for you all to find an image, maybe from one of your favorite repositories or from one that you steward, and do the same process and sort of talk through what it looks like to engage with reverse image lookup as a possible tool or method for conducting some assessment work. So what I'm going to do is, first of all, go away from our slide deck and go to the DCraft webpage, right? And so all of the things that we've spent years in the making creating, and that Ayla and Ranti just gave you an overview of, are all contained within this page, right? And so a wealth of information, a wealth of resources available to you to begin to think about what an assessment would look like for use and reuse of your digital objects or digital content. We're not going to go through any of that though. We're going to hone right in on some of the assessment methods, and in particular on one called reverse image search. Okay. So this is what the typical page for each method looks like. And depending on who created it and how much information is available, you can scroll longer at times and shorter at times, right? So each page, as Ranti mentioned, has a definition. So you can see here that reverse image search, which is also often called reverse image lookup, are tools that query and identify instances of the exact image or similar image found on publicly indexed websites based on the original image's attributes and underlying metadata. And so reverse image search allows you to, instead of use phrases to find maybe an image in your digital collection, you can use the image itself to query across the web, essentially. Because these tools report on instances of use and reuse, they're frequently used by copyright holders, including artists, photographers, and corporations, to investigate unauthorized uses of images over the web. So it's not designed to do assessment work for digital collections. However, we found this, like most of the other methods we've identified, there are ways that you can be intentional with using these methods to pursue an assessment for use and reuse in digital collections. And so there's a whole nother section here that really walks the practitioner through what that begins to look like, right? So it requires the user to select an image, submit it to the tool, and then that the tool will then scan publicly indexed pages that it ordinarily indexes and shoot out some results to you. And we're going to see that here in a second. Now, that isn't the totality of the assessment. In some ways, it just gives you data in which you can then analyze over time to better understand who might be using your digital images across the web and for what purposes. And again, it can't answer everything for you, but it gives you a better sense of what's going on. Now, in addition to sort of outlining that sort of overview for you all, it also provides you with information on some of the different tools that are available. Now, some of the methods we've identified, if you go to different pages, might have fewer tools. Some methods might have more. For some methods, the tools that are listed are the only tools available. For others, they're just a selection based on the resources we had and the information we could capture about particular tools. So just be aware that as you navigate the different methods, they aren't always comprehensive or exhaustive, but at least would be a selection of possible resources you could utilize to do this assessment. We remind folks that ethical guidelines are important and to consider those as you conduct work with this particular assessment method. And then we outline the strengths and the weaknesses, because no tool or no method will be completely aligned with all of the parameters that you have to think about when you do an assessment. And certainly because none of these methods or tools are designed from the beginning, or even a majority of their design is for an assessment for digital collections, you have to be really aware of what the parameters are, and that no one particular tool will help you ultimately do a comprehensive assessment in and of itself. You may have to combine them or be really transparent with what the limitations are. And so these strengths and weaknesses begin to tell you some of that information. And then here you can get some really good use case or case studies on how different digital library practitioners or practitioners in the Glamour field have used this particular resource as a type of assessment mechanism. So having said all of that, we're going to do a live demo. And then of course, here's the tutorial that Ranti walked you through. And you can click on this. There's a video you can watch. You can go through a series of modules and then answer questions to test your understanding of what you've learned and all that kind of fun stuff. So we're going to do a live demo of two particular tools for reverse image search. One is Google image search, and another is TinEye reverse image search. And so I have already downloaded that image of the Olympic flag from 1996 onto my computer. And when you go to Google Images, and again, you can do that by, Googling it, or you can go to our page and go to Google image search here, and you can learn more about the tool itself, right? That's what all of this stuff is, plus the actual URL is included. But when you go to Google image search, and here I'm going to drag and drop over the image, it gives me the option. First of all, it's so interesting because we rely on third-party tools often. The interface and the way that these things work change over time, and they've changed even since we've developed and launched the website, the dCraft Toolkit. So previously, this sort of interface didn't exist. It looked very different. And so, you just have to sort of keep up with the times as these tools change. But essentially what has happened is it's queried this image, and it's begun to give you examples of similar images across the web. And that is, and sometimes, and for some cases, interesting. But if I'm doing an assessment over an exact image, I don't want to see like similar images. I want to know the exact. And so it does give you an option to choose the exact image search. We're going to do. And here it gives you a whole list of instances it has found this image across the web that Google indexes, right? And so depending on the type of image, how popular it is, how well your sites are indexed, and all the kind of web best practices that determine discoverability, you might find that your image pops up really highly in this list. So good news to New Georgia Encyclopedia. They happen to be the first choice in the list of results. That isn't always the case though, right? Sometimes you might not see your actual institution on the first page or on the first few pages. And it all has to do with what Google does and how it indexes and optimal search processes and all that kind of fun stuff. So you can see here, though, in this list, there are really some other interesting instances of this object being reused over the web. So Wikipedia is using it. There are different websites, Rough Draft Atlanta using it, Secret Atlanta, someone on LinkedIn, right? And so all of these can begin to give you an understanding of what might be viable instances of reuse of that particular image across the web. And the really interesting thing is because we're relying on third-party tools that aren't built for this activity, but we're just sort of making it work, right? You might get different results depending on the particular search engine that you use. So the other search engine I wanted to clue you all into is a site called TinEye. And okay, I'm going to have to do this. Let me move this out of here. I'm going to upload this same image if I can find it. There it is. And it's going to run its own query, right? And it just happens to also have identified the Georgia Encyclopedia as the top hit, right? And Wikipedia as some others. But then as you go down, there are some other interesting websites that, might represent maybe publications or blogs, or sometimes artists reselling things, or personal expressions of, maybe family history, or I don't know, what people just happen to be interested in, right? So again, you'll see some really interesting results, right? But those results in and itself will not necessarily do the assessment for you. You might then have to go in and collect all of the results and categorize or code or interpret those results in meaningful ways in order to tell stories of impact to a particular audience. So in a lot of ways, what dCraft does is it positions you to collect the data that you need and then gives you the building blocks to tell those stories. but ultimately how you tell the stories, what you decide to include and not include, or what you decide to use as your evidence will be largely up to you, again, based on the context in which you're trying to tell the story. I want to make sure I captured everything there. And again, the results here and the differences between Google, for example, and TinEye really should encourage you all to look closely at what those strengths and weaknesses are listed on each method. Because depending on what you're searching, you may get wildly different results for what Google does and what TinEye does, or Yandex or Bing or whatever other engine you use for reverse image lookup. And so you want to be aware of the limitations of the data that you're collecting and why things are represented in the ways that they are. You also want to be aware of sort of just what the limits are of reverse image search. There are some things that just will not scan. So if you're really interested in knowing, for example, I don't know, how classrooms have used images or your collections in lesson plans, if those aren't online, reverse image search is not going to help you with that. You'll have to choose a different approach and a different method and set of tools. So again, like, because there's no one size fits all approach, you just have to be really mindful and intentional with what assessment approach you take and how you interpret the results that you get out of that assessment approach. So with that, I think I'm going to stop sharing because I can't see what's going on. We'll take a second here to sort of see what questions folks have. And then if folks would also like to run quickly their own example of a query to a reverse image search engine and share what you have found, we're open to hearing that as well, because you get really interesting results that I think a lot of us in the practitioner world don't always think of as viable or even possible instances of use and reuse. So I'm seeing one question starting off from Teresa that says, now that the initial IMLS grant has concluded, are there plans for ongoing toolkit maintenance or future enhancements? That's such a great question. Thanks, Teresa. So one of the things that the group did fairly shortly after the grant concluded was that we came up with what did we call it? A sustainability plan, where we articulated what are we willing to do and what are we not willing to do to keep this thing alive moving forward, right? And so what we basically agreed upon is that any kind of minor edits or tweaks to information that might be slightly outdated, we are willing to update. But because this website is so interconnected with one another, and because we've created online modules and online videos that we no longer have funding to recreate or support or develop new content for, we will not be, at least in this incarnation of the project, we will not be adding new content for those kinds of materials. Now, it's still unclear to me where we go as a group, right? And what our next big ideas and projects are. Maybe sometime down the road, that might be a version 2 approach to the toolkit, where we do some of those things, like we find new and emerging approaches, methodologies, and tools and incorporate it in. But all of that would take funding and a lot of willpower that we will have eventually. But right now, I think both are lacking a little, having gone through a pretty long process from 2019 to 2023 to build and then deploy this. But of course, Ayla and Ranti, if you have other thoughts on that, I'll defer to you all as well.
Nope, you nailed it.
Any other thoughts or questions? And folks can feel free to unmute if they would like, if it makes it more approachable.
I can go ahead and share. I tried the reverse image search for a certain pin that's related to the Olympics that were held here in Salt Lake. Sorry, I'm not sure why it's feeding back like that. I'm putting a link here in the chat. And I actually did not find any matches for it. But when it's our local digital library at University of Utah. But when I do choose find image source, it does link me to someone selling this pin, like a third-party seller.
Yeah. Yeah. And so you never, again, and the technology for reverse image search has changed so much in just the years that we've been tracking it for this project. It constantly amazes me what some of the new features are, right? But Teresa, what you found is not unusual. I mean, these images have to be indexed in certain ways in search engines for them to be discoverable, right? And so, again, because this tool isn't intended to help glamour practitioners find instances of use and reuse, we just really have to make it work, right? And so there are definitely flaws or for sure limitations in this. We also don't know, and this is listed on the RL page, like when these different companies make changes to the algorithm or changes to their approach, we don't know what motivating factors prioritize certain kinds of images over others. Like all of that you have to sort of be at least cognizant of, right? Because it for sure can impact the data that you collect and can even impact the data you collect from one point to another. So if you did the search today, Teresa, and you came back in 6 months and did that same search, you still might not find anything. You might find more things, or they might be totally disconnected from what you were expecting them to be, right? And that's part of like the both amazing journey and wild ride that this can be, right? So I will put out one plug, I would say, if you all find that this is a helpful resource or not a helpful resource, we would really appreciate learning more about how you've engaged with the toolkit and what, if anything, you got out of it. We've spent a long time building it and talking to practitioners and iterating from that feedback, right? And we've now launched it and I have no real idea, like, it doesn't really matter, or people using it, what kind of value are people getting out of it? So any information you all have on that, we would really appreciate. And Ranti just put it in the chat, thank you, the way to contact us. So.
Awesome. I'll put in a brief plug for our feedback for this session as well. Challenge just posted the link a couple minutes ago. If folks want to take a moment to fill that out, that will go back to the project team here today and also give us a good idea of where to go with future sessions with this working group. So, but if there's no more questions, I think we're probably ready to wind down. Thank you everybody for presenting today. Thank you for coming. And as we said before, we'll post this recording fairly soon through the DPLA YouTube channel.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
All right. Thanks, everyone.